Did you do this to me?
I think you already know the answer to that question. I just don't think you're ready to hear it yet.
The machines beside Theo's hospital bed beeped in a rhythm too fast for a man who was supposedly stable, and Camille sat in the chair beside him, hands folded in her lap, watching him watch her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in 12 years of marriage. "They found something in my blood," he said, voice hoarse from the tube they'd removed that morning. "Something that shouldn't be there. Something that builds up slowly, over months." "That's frightening," Camille said, and she meant it, though not for the reason he assumed. "You made my tea every night," he said. "You've made my tea every night for years." "I did," she said. "I still do." He stared at her for a long moment, something calculating moving behind his eyes even through the exhaustion, and she stared back without blinking, without offering him anything more than what he'd already asked for. "Camille," he said finally, quieter now, almost pleading. "Did you do this to me?" She let the silence sit there long enough to mean something before she answered. "Theo," she said, "I think you already know the answer to that question. I just don't think you're ready to hear it yet. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a husband ended up in a hospital bed asking his wife if she'd poisoned him, you have to go back exactly 1 year to a marriage that looked, from any reasonable distance, like it was simply going through an ordinary rough patch. Camille and Theo had been married 12 years when the trouble started. High school sweethearts who'd built a life together with the kind of steady, unremarkable happiness that doesn't make for dramatic stories until suddenly, without warning, it does. They'd met at 17, in a shared chemistry class neither of them particularly excelled at, bonding over a disastrous lab experiment that left them both banned from handling the Bunsen burners for the rest of the semester. Camille would say, in the easier years of their marriage, that she'd fallen for Theo somewhere around their 3rd study session together, watching him patiently explain a concept to a younger classmate with a kindness that felt, even at 17, like a preview of the kind of man he might grow into. She worked as a paralegal at a mid-sized firm downtown, meticulous and well-liked, the kind of person colleagues brought their most disorganized case files to because she could find order in almost anything. Theo ran a small logistics company he'd built from nothing over a decade, successful enough to have bought them a comfortable house in a good neighborhood, stressed enough, in recent years, that the comfort had started to feel like it was costing him something he couldn't quite name. Their early years together had been genuinely happy ones, by any honest account either of them would have given at the time. Modest apartments upgraded slowly into the house they eventually bought, a wedding that Camille's mother still talked about years later as one of the best days of her own life, a rhythm to their marriage that felt, for the better part of a decade, like something solid enough to weather whatever came at it. Theo had proposed on the same chemistry classroom's front steps, years after graduation, a callback neither of them ever fully explained to friends who found the location strange for a proposal, and Camille had said yes before he'd even finished getting the full question out. The first real crack, the one Camille could point to later with any confidence, came about 14 months before the hospital room conversation, when Theo's company lost its 2 largest contracts within the same difficult quarter. He didn't talk about it much at home, which wasn't unusual for him. He'd always kept the harder parts of running a business mostly to himself, preferring to present a steady face to Camille rather than burden her with numbers she couldn't do anything about. What was unusual was how the stress seemed to settle into him differently this time, a kind of low, persistent tension that didn't fully lift even on good days, evenings where he'd go quiet for long stretches, weekends where he'd disappear into his home office with the door shut for hours at a time. Camille noticed the distance the way people notice most gradual things, slowly, and then, in retrospect, obviously. She remembered one evening in particular, about 2 months into the shift, sitting across from him at dinner while he pushed food around his plate without really eating it. "You've been somewhere else lately," she said. "Even when you're sitting right here." "Just tired," he said, not looking up. "It's been a hard stretch at work. Do you want to talk about it? I might not understand the logistics side of it, but I'm pretty good at untangling messes for a living." He almost told her that night. She would think about that moment often, later, once she understood the full shape of what he'd been carrying. The way his shoulders had dropped for just a second, like he was about to let something out, before he caught himself and offered her a tired, deflecting smile instead. "It's really nothing you need to worry about," he said. "I've got it handled." She asked him more than once, in the weeks that followed, some version of the same question, and he told her. Each time, some version of the truth that wasn't the whole truth. Work stress, cash flow problems, the ordinary weight of running a business through a hard year. She believed him, because there was no immediate reason not to, and because 12 years of marriage had taught her that Theo processed hard things by retreating rather than by talking them through in real time. She gave him the space she thought he needed, not yet understanding that the space was hiding something considerably darker than a rough business quarter. What Camille wouldn't know for months, was that Theo's company wasn't simply having a hard quarter. It was quietly, catastrophically failing, propped up by loans he'd personally guaranteed against their house, and against a life insurance policy he'd taken out on Camille years earlier, back when they were young, and it had seemed like nothing more than responsible financial planning. That policy, a decision made in their late 20s with no darker intention behind it than protecting each other's future, had grown over a decade into a sum large enough that Theo, drowning in a debt he saw no honest way out of, had begun to think about it in ways he was deeply ashamed of and unable, once the thought had taken root, to fully dislodge. The debt had crept up on him gradually, the way most financial catastrophes do. A bad contract here, an overextended equipment purchase there, decisions that had each felt reasonable in isolation but had compounded, over 18 months, into a hole he genuinely didn't know how to climb out of through any honest means available to him. He'd tried, in the earlier months, to fix it the ordinary way, refinancing, seeking new clients, cutting costs anywhere he could find them. None of it moved fast enough against the collection calls that had started arriving weekly, then daily, each one chipping away at whatever composure he'd managed to maintain the day before. He would sit alone in his home office some nights, doors shut, running numbers that never balanced no matter how many times he rearranged them. And somewhere in one of those long, isolated nights, the thought of the insurance policy had first surfaced, not as a plan yet, just an awareness, cold and unwelcome, that the number attached to Camille's life was large enough to solve every problem currently sitting on his desk. He hated himself for the thought the first time it arrived. He hated himself less the 5th time, and by the 10th, the hatred had started to feel less like a moral objection and more like a familiar, exhausting obstacle standing between him and the only solution he could see. He would tell himself, in the months that followed, that he wasn't the kind of man capable of what he was actually planning. He would go days at a time convinced he'd talked himself out of it, only for a new collection call or a new default notice to arrive and pull the thought back to the surface, more fully formed each time it returned. He researched carefully, methodically, the way he approached everything in his business, reading about substances that built up gradually in a person's system, that mimicked the symptoms of ordinary illness, that wouldn't raise obvious alarm in a woman whose own doctor already knew she'd been dealing with stress-related stomach trouble for the better part of the year. He told himself, each time he added a small amount to her evening tea, that he could still stop, that tonight didn't have to be the night, that he had time to change his mind. He kept telling himself that for the better part of 4 months. Camille's symptoms started subtly enough that neither she nor her doctor initially connected them to anything beyond ordinary stress. Mild nausea some evenings, a persistent low-grade fatigue, occasional dizziness that she attributed, reasonably, to the demands of a heavy caseload at work. She mentioned it to her doctor at a routine checkup, and they discussed stress management, sleep hygiene, the usual conversation two busy professionals have when neither one is thinking to look for anything more alarming underneath ordinary tiredness. She started drinking more water, tried to get to bed earlier, made small adjustments to a life that seemed, from the inside, like it simply needed some minor recalibration rather than urgent investigation. The pattern that eventually caught her attention wasn't dramatic. It was small, and it took her nearly 3 weeks of half-conscious noticing before she let herself fully articulate what she was seeing. The nausea and dizziness were worse, consistently, on nights when Theo made her evening tea, a small ritual he'd taken over about 2 months earlier, framing it as a kindness, a way of taking one small thing off her plate during a stressful season at the firm. She hadn't thought anything of the timing at first. It was easy enough to attribute the correlation to any number of ordinary explanations. But the pattern held steady enough, week after week, that eventually the part of her brain trained by years of careful paralegal work, the part that noticed inconsistencies other people glossed over, refused to let the coincidence go unexamined any longer. She started paying closer attention without telling him she was paying attention, an old instinct from her work that translated, uncomfortably, into her own home. She noticed that Theo never drank the same tea she did, always claiming he preferred coffee in the evenings, a preference she now realized. Looking back, he developed sometime around the same period he'd taken over making her tea. She noticed a faint, unfamiliar bitterness in her cup some nights that she'd previously dismissed as a new brand or a stronger steep. The garage discovery happened on a Thursday evening she would remember in unusual detail for months afterward. She'd gone out to grab a box of old files she'd stored there for work, moving quietly in sock feet, and found Theo standing at the far shelf, a small, unmarked container in his hand, studying it with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Not quite guilt, not quite fear, something closer to the specific concentration of a man doing careful math in his head. "What's that?" she asked, and watched him nearly drop the container in his haste to close his hand around it and slide it behind a row of old paint cans. "Nothing," he said, too quickly, turning to face her with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Just some old cleaning supplies I was sorting through. Half of this stuff needs to go to the hazardous waste drop-off." "You look like you'd seen a ghost." "Just tired," he said, the same 2 words he'd been using for months by then. And she let it go that night the way she'd let a dozen smaller things go before it, filing the moment away with a discomfort she couldn't yet fully name. She noticed, in the days that followed, that he moved differently around that particular shelf, a wide, unconscious berth whenever he passed it, a stiffness in his shoulders she'd learned, over 12 years, to associate with something he was actively working to hide. She didn't confront him that night, or the next, or for nearly 2 weeks afterward. What she felt, sitting with the growing certainty of what she was looking at, wasn't primarily fear for her own safety in the way movies might suggest, though there was some of that underneath everything else. What she felt most, in those first days of clarity, was a strange, cold calm. The same calm she brought to disentangling a badly organized case file at work, a sense that the situation, however alarming, was still a problem that could be approached methodically rather than one that required an immediate, dramatic reaction. She understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that confronting Theo directly carried real risk. A man desperate enough to poison his own wife slowly over months was not a man she could predict the reaction of if cornered too quickly, without proof strong enough to protect her afterward. She understood, too, that going to the police with nothing more than a suspicious bitterness and an unfamiliar container found on a garage shelf would likely accomplish very little beyond alerting Theo that she was onto him, giving him time to either escalate or cover his tracks entirely. What she needed, she decided over those 2 weeks of careful, private thinking, was time, evidence, and a way to protect herself in the meantime that didn't require tipping her hand before she was ready. The solution she landed on was almost absurdly simple, the kind of quiet, practical countermeasure that only made sense to someone who had spent a career finding the smallest workable answer inside a complicated problem. She started swapping the cups. It began the way most careful deceptions begin, small and almost accidental looking. Some nights, she'd ask him to bring both cups to the living room instead of leaving them where he'd set them, using the moment of transfer, brief and unremarkable, to switch which cup sat where. Other nights, she'd simply set both cups down together while she finished something in another room, giving herself the 30 seconds she needed to swap them once his attention was elsewhere. She never took the same approach twice in a row, careful not to establish a pattern he might notice the way she'd noticed his. Within the first 2 weeks of doing this, she confirmed what she'd already suspected. On the nights she successfully swapped the cups, Theo grew quiet and tired in exactly the way she used to, complaining of a headache or an upset stomach he attributed to a long day. She never said a word about it. Neither did he. Camille did not do this out of any impulse toward revenge, not in those early weeks. She would tell you, honestly, that her first and primary motivation was survival, removing herself, as completely as she could without alerting him, from whatever slow harm he was doing to her, while she figured out what came next. What happened to Theo on the nights the cups were swapped was, in her own accounting of it at the time, simply the unavoidable consequence of protecting herself with the only tool she had available. She did not increase the frequency. She did not seek out additional opportunities. She simply, quietly, stopped being the only one drinking what he'd prepared. What she did do, in parallel, was begin building a case with the same careful discipline she brought to the most complicated files at work. She started saving small, unlabeled samples from evenings she didn't swap the cups, sealing them in containers she kept hidden in a lockbox at her sister's house rather than anywhere Theo might stumble across them. She began documenting dates, symptoms, and patterns in a private notebook she kept at the office rather than at home. She scheduled a follow-up appointment with her doctor under the pretense of ongoing stress symptoms, this time requesting blood work specifically, results that came back showing trace levels of a substance her doctor flagged immediately as inconsistent with anything she should reasonably have in her system, results Camille photographed and stored securely before Theo could ever have reason to see the report. She consulted, quietly and outside their shared insurance and financial records, with an attorney 2 towns over who had no connection to Theo's circle and no reason to mention the meeting to anyone. The attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Patricia Ellery, listened to the full account without interrupting once. The symptoms, the garage container, the blood work, the timeline, taking careful notes on a legal pad rather than reacting with the alarm Camille had half-braced herself for. The instinct to confront him is going to get stronger every day you sit with this, Patricia told her, once Camille had finished. I need you to resist it. Cases like this are won or lost on documentation gathered before the confrontation, not after. If you go to the police right now with what you've told me, you have a suspicious container and a hunch. That's not enough to protect you, and it's more than enough to tip him off. So what do I do in the meantime? Camille asked. I can't keep drinking whatever he's putting in that tea. No, Patricia agreed. You can't. But how you stop drinking it matters just as much as the fact that you stop. Anything that looks like an accusation before we have real evidence puts you in more danger, not less. Camille left that meeting with a clear understanding of exactly what evidence she would need to protect herself legally, and exactly how dangerous it would be to act prematurely without it. Patricia's advice, documented, careful, evidence before confrontation, became the framework Camille built the following months around, methodical by nature, taking the guidance as seriously as she'd ever taken anything in her professional life. 3 months passed this way. Camille swapping cups on a deliberately irregular schedule, gathering evidence in careful silence, watching Theo grow increasingly, mysteriously unwell without ever once suspecting the true source of his own decline. The first month, the changes in him were subtle enough that even Camille, watching closely, wasn't entirely certain what she was seeing. He complained of feeling run down, attributed it to the stress of the business, went to bed earlier than his usual pattern without either of them remarking on it directly. She kept her own notebook updated in the evenings after he'd fallen asleep, recording which nights she'd successfully swapped the cups against which symptoms he mentioned the following day, watching a pattern take shape that mirrored, with an exactness that unsettled her even as it confirmed what she needed to know, the exact pattern she'd lived through herself months earlier. By the second month, the symptoms had become obvious enough that Theo started mentioning them to Camille directly, something he rarely did about his own health. I don't know what's wrong with me, he told her one evening, sitting on the edge of their bed, looking genuinely frightened in a way she hadn't seen from him before. I feel like I did during that stomach bug last year, except it won't go away. Maybe you should see the doctor, Camille said, keeping her voice carefully neutral, watching him nod and rub his temples, entirely unaware of the doubled meaning sitting in the room with them. He saw his own doctor twice during those 3 months, complaining of fatigue and nausea that mirrored, with an irony he had no way of recognizing, the exact symptoms he'd been slowly inflicting on his wife for months before that. His doctor, seeing nothing immediately alarming in a basic panel of blood work run at a routine visit, suggested stress management and better sleep, the same well-meaning, incomplete advice Camille's own doctor had once given her before anyone thought to look deeper. Camille watched this unfold with an expression she never let slip in front of him. Not satisfaction exactly, though she wouldn't have denied there was some grim, complicated relief in watching a plan built on her death slowly consume the person who'd built it instead. Mostly what she felt, in the quiet hours after he'd gone to bed early yet again, complaining of a headache, was a kind of exhausted vigilance, the sense of a woman running two full-time jobs at once. The version of her life Theo still believed was ordinary, and the second, secret version where she was quietly building the case that would eventually end it. The collapse that put Theo in the hospital happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, for months after Camille had first noticed the pattern in her own symptoms. He'd been complaining of chest tightness and severe dizziness for 2 days, symptoms he'd been minimizing to Camille the way he minimized most things, insisting each morning that he was fine, that he just needed more sleep, that he had too much going on at work to spend an afternoon in an urgent care waiting room. She heard the fall before she understood what it was. A heavy, sudden sound from upstairs that sent her running before her mind had fully caught up to what she was moving toward. She found him in the hallway outside their bedroom, disoriented and struggling to form full sentences, one hand pressed weakly against his chest, his skin an unsettling shade she'd never seen on him before. Whatever complicated calculation she'd been running for 3 months fell away entirely in that moment, replaced by something older and more automatic. She was on the phone with emergency services within seconds, following their instructions exactly, staying on the line the entire time it took paramedics to arrive. She rode with him to the hospital, sat in the waiting room for 3 hours giving honest, detailed answers to every question the doctors asked about his recent symptoms, the fatigue, the nausea, the dizziness building over months. Answers that were, notably, entirely truthful, since she had never once lied about what she'd observed of his declining health, only about her understanding of its cause. A nurse asked her, gently, if there was anything unusual in his diet or environment that might explain the pattern, and Camille, sitting in that hard plastic chair at 2 in the morning, felt the full weight of the answer she wasn't yet ready to give. The toxicology results came back 2 days into his hospital stay, flagging a substance accumulation the attending physician described to Camille in the hallway outside Theo's room, as consistent with prolonged, low-dose exposure over a period of months rather than a single acute incident. The physician asked Camille, carefully and without accusation, whether Theo had access to any chemicals through his work, whether he'd expressed any unusual behavior, whether there was anything about his recent routine that might explain the exposure. Camille answered every question honestly and precisely, offering nothing beyond what was directly asked, watching the medical team begin, entirely on their own, to consider possibilities that had nothing yet to do with her. It was 2 days after that conversation that Theo, alone with Camille in his hospital room for the first time since the toxicology results came back, asked her the question he'd clearly been turning over since he first heard the word accumulation from his own doctor. Sitting there, watching him ask if she'd done this to him, Camille understood she had finally arrived at the moment she'd spent 3 months carefully preparing for. The moment where the truth, however she chose to reveal it, would need to hold up to more scrutiny than a hospital room conversation alone could provide. She didn't confess to him that day, and she didn't deny it outright either, giving him instead the answer she'd given, that he already knew, that he wasn't ready to hear it. What she did, within 48 hours of that conversation, was contact her attorney and, together, they made the decision to bring everything to the police. The saved samples, the blood work, the notebook of dates and symptoms, a search of Theo's home office computer that Camille had legal standing to authorize as his spouse. Detective Osei walked Camille through the results of that search personally, laying out printed pages across a conference table at the precinct with the same careful, unhurried method she recognized from her own work. The search histories and financial records that turned up made the full shape of Theo's plan devastatingly clear: the failing business, the insurance policy, the mounting debt, and a search history stretching back nearly 5 months that left very little room for alternate explanation. There were queries about substances that built up gradually, about symptoms that mimicked ordinary illness, about detection windows and half-lives, each search more specific than the last, forming a timeline that mapped almost exactly onto the months Camille had spent quietly documenting her own declining health. "I want to be honest with you," Osei told her, sliding the final page across the table. "Cases like this don't usually come to us this well documented. Most spouses in your position either never figure it out or figure it out too late to do anything but survive it. What you did here, the samples, the notebook, timing the swaps the way you did, that's going to matter enormously once this goes in front of a jury. Camille sat with that for a long moment, feeling something loosen in her chest that she hadn't fully realized she'd been holding since the night she first found that container. It was the first time since this had all started that someone else had looked at the full scope of what she'd done and called it, plainly, exactly what it was. Theo was arrested in his hospital bed, still recovering, still weak enough that 2 officers had to help him into a wheelchair for transport once he was medically cleared for discharge into custody. He didn't deny it once the evidence was laid out in front of him during questioning. The financial records alone made denial largely pointless, and whatever fight had been left in him seemed to drain out entirely once he understood the scope of what Camille had quietly assembled over 3 careful months while he believed himself to be the one in control of the situation. The detective who led the interview, a measured, unhurried man named Osei who'd handled more than a few cases like this over 2 decades on the force, told Camille afterward that Theo's confession, once it came, had been almost anticlimactic in its completeness, a man who seemed, by that point, more exhausted by the effort of maintaining the deception than afraid of what admitting to it might cost him. Theo told detectives he'd started researching the substance nearly 5 months before he first used it, that he'd talked himself out of it more times than he could count, that some part of him had genuinely hoped, each time he added it to her tea, that he would find another way out of the debt before he had to see it through to its intended conclusion. He never fully explained, in any interview transcript Camille eventually read, why that other way out never seemed to arrive. The investigation that followed uncovered the full timeline in painstaking detail. The exact date Theo had purchased the substance, traced through a records request his attorney couldn't successfully suppress. The exact week he'd begun incorporating it into Camille's evening tea. The insurance policy documents showing a payout structure that would have cleared his business debt with room to spare. Prosecutors built a case for attempted murder that, according to the attorney who eventually represented Camille through the divorce proceedings that followed, was about as thoroughly documented as any case of its kind she'd seen in over a decade of practice. A direct result, she told Camille more than once, of Camille's own methodical discipline in gathering evidence rather than acting on instinct alone. Camille filed for divorce the week after Theo's arrest, a process that moved forward largely uncontested given the criminal proceedings running in parallel. She did not visit him in jail while he awaited trial. She did not respond to the 2 letters he sent her through his attorney, both of which she turned over unopened to her own attorney rather than reading them herself, unwilling to give him any further access to her attention or her emotional energy after everything he'd already taken. Her sister Danielle, whose house had quietly held the lockbox of evidence for months, was the one person Camille allowed fully into the emotional weight of it all, sitting with her through evenings that alternated between numb exhaustion and sudden, overwhelming waves of a grief that surprised Camille every time it surfaced. Not grief for Theo exactly, but for the 12 years of marriage she'd genuinely believed in, now recontextualized entirely by what she'd learned. "I keep trying to figure out when he actually stopped being the person I married," she told Danielle one night, "and I can't find the moment. I don't think there was one. I think it just happened slowly enough that I never caught it until it was already this." Danielle, who had watched her sister carry the full weight of those 3 months almost entirely alone, told her something that night that Camille repeated to herself often in the months that followed. "You don't owe him the effort of understanding when he changed," Danielle said. "You survived him. That's the only part of this that has to make sense to you." Camille didn't have a response for that right away, but she thought about it for days afterward, turning it over the way she turned over difficult case files at work, slowly letting it settle into something she could actually believe rather than just hear. When people in her life gently asked, in the months that followed, whether she thought there was any chance of eventually reconciling once he'd served whatever sentence the court handed down, she told them, without hesitation and without room for further discussion, that there wasn't, and that she needed the people around her to stop asking. Her mother, still processing her own shock at learning what had happened to her daughter, asked once whether Camille thought Theo's desperation over the business made any of it more understandable. Camille told her, evenly, that understanding why a person does something and forgiving them for it were two entirely different things, and that she had no intention of confusing the two just because the why happened to be comprehensible. Theo was convicted 8 months later, the trial itself lasting less than 2 weeks given the strength of the physical and financial evidence against him. Camille testified for most of one full day, walking the jury through the same careful timeline she'd once walked her attorney through. The symptoms, the garage discovery, the blood work, the 3 months of quiet cup swapping she described in plain, unemotional terms that several jurors later told reporters had been more convincing than any dramatic account could have been. She did not look at Theo while she testified, keeping her attention on the prosecutor asking the questions, though she was aware, throughout, of him watching her from the defense table with an expression she made a deliberate choice not to study too closely. The defense's strategy, such as it was, leaned heavily on Theo's financial desperation as a mitigating factor rather than a justification, an argument the jury deliberated on for less than 4 hours before returning a conviction. He was sentenced to a significant term in state prison, the exact number of years less important to Camille, she would say later, than the simple fact of the conviction itself, a clear, public, undeniable acknowledgement of what he had actually done, rather than the private, unresolved suspicion she might otherwise have carried for the rest of her life without it. She attended the sentencing hearing but declined the opportunity to give a victim impact statement, telling her attorney privately that she'd already said everything she needed to say during her testimony, and that she didn't owe the courtroom, or Theo, any additional performance of grief or anger beyond the facts she'd already laid out plainly. Theo, given the opportunity to address her directly before sentencing, offered an apology that Camille received with the same careful neutrality she'd maintained throughout the entire process, neither accepting nor rejecting it out loud, simply letting the words exist in the room without granting them any particular weight. Camille sold the house within the year, unwilling to keep living inside the physical space where she'd spent 3 months quietly protecting herself from a threat sitting across the dinner table from her every night. She moved into a smaller place closer to her sister, the same sister whose house had quietly held a lockbox full of evidence for months without either of them ever discussing directly what was inside it. The new apartment had almost nothing in common with the house she'd shared with Theo, smaller, brighter, decorated entirely according to her own taste for the first time in over a decade, a deliberate choice she made room by room as she settled in. She kept her job at the firm, kept the same colleagues who'd known nothing about any of it while it was happening, and slowly, deliberately, rebuilt a version of her daily life that no longer required the constant, exhausting vigilance those 3 months had demanded of her. Her supervisor, once the story became public through local news coverage of the trial, offered her as much time off as she needed. Camille declined most of it, telling her honestly that the structure of her regular caseload had become, somewhere in the middle of the worst months of her life, one of the few things that still felt entirely normal and entirely hers. The first few months in the new apartment were harder than she'd expected, not because she missed Theo, but because the quiet itself took some adjusting to. Evenings with nothing to monitor, no cups to track, no second, secret version of her life running underneath the visible one. She found herself, more than once in those early weeks, standing at her own stove out of old habit, watching the kettle heat, before remembering there was no longer any reason to watch it that closely. It took the better part of a year before making a simple cup of tea stopped feeling, on some quiet, involuntary level, like an act requiring vigilance. She did not, in the years that followed, describe herself as someone who had moved past what happened, exactly. She would tell you, if you asked her directly, that she had simply integrated it, folded it into the ongoing story of her own life the way a person folds in any hard chapter, without pretending it hadn't happened, and without letting it define every chapter that came after it. She dated, eventually, though carefully and slowly, telling any partner serious enough to warrant the conversation the full truth of what had happened to her, watching closely, each time, for how they absorbed it. Most handled it with a clumsy, well-meaning discomfort that told her more about them than they probably realized. Too many questions asked too quickly, or, worse, a strained effort to move past the subject as fast as possible, as though her survival were an inconvenience to whatever easy narrative they'd hoped to build with her. One relationship, about 2 years after the trial, lasted the better part of a year before ending for reasons that had nothing to do with Theo at all, an ordinary incompatibility that Camille found, to her own quiet relief, entirely refreshing in its ordinariness. Proof, she told Danielle afterward, that not every hard thing in her life going forward had to trace back to the same source. She eventually found her way to a quieter, steadier relationship with a man named Aaron, an accountant, 2 firms over whom she'd met through a mutual colleague at a work function neither of them had particularly wanted to attend. She told him the full truth on their 3rd date, watching him carefully as she always did, and found, to her genuine surprise, that his first response wasn't a question about Theo at all, but a quiet acknowledgement of how much strength the 3 months she described must have taken. It was, she would say later, one of the only responses in years of careful disclosures that had actually made her feel understood rather than examined. If you asked Camille today what she took from those 3 months, she wouldn't tell you it was a lesson about revenge, a framing she rejected clearly and consistently whenever anyone tried to apply it to her story. She would tell you it was a lesson about the specific, unglamorous power of patience, that the version of herself capable of saving her own life wasn't the version who confronted Theo the night she found that container on the garage shelf, but the version who understood, with a clarity she still trusted completely, that some threats can only be survived by moving slower and more carefully than the person who created them. She kept the small notebook she'd used to document those months, long after any legal need for it had passed, tucked away in a drawer in her new apartment rather than displayed anywhere visible. She wasn't entirely sure, even years later, why she'd held on to it rather than destroying it along with almost everything else that connected her to that chapter of her life. The closest she ever came to explaining it, in a conversation with Danielle late one evening, was that the notebook had been the first proof she ever had of her own capacity to survive something methodically rather than simply endure it. Evidence, in the end, not just of what Theo had done, but of exactly what she was capable of when everything depended on her staying clear-headed enough to see it through. 12 years after the wedding that had once meant everything to her, and roughly 4 years after the conviction that ended it, Camille would describe her life not as one defined by what Theo had tried to take from her, but as one she'd rebuilt, deliberately and on her own terms, into something considerably more honest than the version she'd been living inside without fully realizing it. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to psycheTalesTv for more stories about the quiet, careful strength people find when they need it most, and tell us in the comments what you would have done differently in Camille's position, if anything at all. Before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.